Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Among the Russian authors that Leo Shestov is going to devote some discussion to, scattered across his work, All Things Are Possible, is Anton Chekhov, and he has some very interesting things to say about him and his work, and what we might call his existential attitude as an author. And so I wanted to begin with one that connects explicitly with philosophy and is indeed a recurring theme in Shestov as well as Chekhov. So he tells us Chekhov was very good at expounding a system of philosophy. You do see this in his works, even several systems. We have examples in more than one of his stories, particularly in The Duel, where Van Koren speaks ex cathedra. That means, literally from the chair. It's a way of talking about teaching in an authoritative manner. And then he says, Chekhov himself had no use for such systems, except for purely literary purposes. When you write a story and your hero must speak clearly and consistently, then a system has its value. So, if you're going to be doing some sort of literary work, writing some fiction, perhaps even writing some nonfiction, historical work, an essay on somebody, well then it's great to have philosophies and not just, arbitrary ones, but systems to be able to articulate somebody's thoughts. So perhaps somebody is a utilitarian or a Kantian or a Hegelian or whoever else they're going to be. You can even invent your own system, as, for example, Dostoevsky does with certain of his characters in The Possessed. But let's come back to Chekhov. So what is Chekhov actually doing? So Shestov is going to say, when you're left to yourself, can you seriously trouble your soul about philosophy? Even a German cannot, it seems, go so far in his idealism. So he's got characters like Vladimir Semyonovich, this young author, and Chekhov's Nice People. So an author writing about an author here, Chekhov writing about Vladimir, sincerely and deeply believes in his own ideas, but even of him, notwithstanding his blatantly comical limitations, we cannot say more than that his ideas were constant little views or pictures to him, which gradually become a second natural setting to everything he saw. Certainly he did not live by ideas. He's kind of a mess. Chekhov is right when he says that the singing of Gaudeamus Igitur and the writing of a humanitarian appeal were equally important to this character, and as soon as his sister begins to think for herself, her brother's highest ideas, which she's formerly revered, become banal and objectionable to her. Her brother cannot understand her, neither her hostility to progress and humanitarianism, nor to the university spree and Gaudeamus Igitur, but Chekhov understands. But, he says, the word understand here means something different than its ordinary meaning. And then he gives a sort of almost proverb. So long as the child was fed on its mother's milk, everything to it seemed smooth and easy. And when it had to give up milk and take to vodka, and this is the inevitable law of human development, the childish suckling dreams receded into the realm of irretrievable past. So what is he saying about Chekhov here? At one point, Chekhov, like many other people, could believe in philosophical systems
And then he realized that there's a certain immaturity in buying into these. This may be characteristic of Shestov himself. So then there's a long discussion spanning a number of chapters in part 1, where he's talking about this character Ivanov in Chekhov's drama of that name, and how Chekhov and his character Ivanov are similar but different to each other in important ways. So Ivanov compares himself to an overstrained laborer. The laborer dies so that all that remains to Ivanov is to die. And he says, logic, as you know, recommends great caution in coming to conclusions by analogy. So in here, he's going to touch on the relationship between author and character. Behold Chekhov himself, who, as far as we can judge, endured in his own soul all the tragedy, just as Ivanov had. He did not, that is Chekhov, did not die or think of dying or even turn out a wasted man. He's doing something. So he endures the tragedy. He doesn't kill himself the way that Ivanov does. Why did Ivanov kill himself? Well, Shestov is kind of joking around here, and he said he shot himself because the drama must end. Chekhov had not yet finished his own struggle. Characters can do things that bring things to a conclusion. And then he suggests that, since we've abandoned the Aristotelian unities, given a little more time, dramatic writers will get rid of this restriction altogether. They'll confess they don't know how or with what event to end their dramas. And we do see that, later on in the 20th century, don't we, with this hyper-aware sort of fabulizing that takes place under the absurd or existentialist literature or postmodern ideas as well. Now, coming back, in the very next chapter, he talks about Ivanov says, where is my salvation? In what? If an intelligent, educated, healthy man, for no discoverable reason, sets up a Lazarus lament and starts to roll down an inclined plane, then he's rolling without resisting and there's no salvation for him. Now, what is this actually a reference to? Interestingly, Stoic philosophy. This is a metaphor that goes all the way back to Chrysippus, who was using it to explain how determinism, the notion of a causal nexus in which everything is determined by what came before it, by antecedent causes, and yet freedom could also be coexisting. And so the way it's typically interpreted is you've got a choice about your attitude that you take. The cylinder rolls down the inclined plane. Why? Because of the nature of the cylinder, much like the nature of the human mind. But something else starts it rolling, and then it continues on its own. So Shestov says one way out would be to just accept the inclined plane, and the gathering impetus is normal. That's one possible attitude. You could even find in the rolling descent a proof of one's spiritual superiority to other men, right? And then, you would have to go apart from the rest, not court young girls or fraternize with people who live the ordinary life, but be alone, right? So he says, this is what Ivanov, in fact, does. And Ivanov will live while his creator lives. But we have to listen to the shaky, vacillating philosophy, right? Then he goes on a little bit further, and he identifies Chekhov as taking on the role of a devil's advocate. Wherever Ivanov appears, he brings ruin and destruction. Chekhov hesitates to take his side openly and evidently doesn't know what to do with his hero. So in the end, he shakes him off, washes his hands of him in the accepted fashion. Ivanov shoots himself in the sight of everybody, right? And he says the only justification of Ivanov is the caricature of honesty, Dr. Lvov. Lvov is not a living figure, but this is why he is remarkable. And then he will talk, after just calling him honesty personified, he will talk about Chekhov's Uncle Vanya. Uncle Vanya is waiting to throw himself on the neck of his friend and rival, the doctor, throw himself on his neck and sob there like a little child. But he finds the doctor has himself an unquenchable thirst for consolation and encouragement, and Sonia can bear her maiden sorrows no longer. They all go wandering round with big, lost eyes, looking for someone to relieve them from part of their woes, at least. And look, everybody's in the same street as themselves. All are over heavy laden. No one can carry his own burden, let alone give a lift to another. Each must bear their own cross because nobody else can help them with it. So coming back to this notion of Chekhov as devil's advocate, what is a devil's advocate? We hear people talking about that, and they often mean just being contrary for the sake of being contrary, or being clever and saying, maybe one could see it a different way. And of course, when they do that, they're usually just being kind of pretentious jerks. The actual devil's advocate was part of the process of canonization of saints. The church would make a case for why somebody should actually be granted the official imprimatur of sainthood, which is just recognizing, supposedly, what's actually going on. And then the devil's advocate was part of the process who would say, I think these miracles could be explained in naturalistic ways. Perhaps people hallucinated. Maybe the healing was going to take place anyway, right? They call the saint's character into question. Well, that is what Chekhov is doing through his characters about overly optimistic viewpoints on life. And now we're going to get to thinking about suffering and misfortune. So there's two very interesting things that Shestov is going to bring to our attention. There's a story called Misfortune, and he says, this illustrates the difficulty a man finds in adapting himself to a new truth, if this truth threatens the security of his condition. So we've got this merchant, Avdeir, who doesn't believe he's condemned, that he's been brought to trial and tried and found guilty for his irregularities in a public bank. He mistakenly thinks the verdict is yet to come. He waits. And he says, in the world of learning, something like this is happening. The educated have become so accustomed to think of themselves not guilty, perfectly in the right. They don't admit for a moment that they are brought to court. When threatening voices reach them, calling them to give an account of themselves, they suspiciously shrug their shoulders and say, all this will pass away. When at last they are convinced that misfortune has befallen them, they will begin to justify themselves, declaring they cannot even read printed matter sufficiently well, and for the moment they pass for respectable, wise, experienced, omniscient people, right? So this is a case where the misfortune is not yet apparent. People are able to forestall it. But there's much misfortune, later on he talks about, in Chekhov's work, where it can't actually be explained away. Now, one way that people will explain away misfortune, he talks about here, is through metaphysics and poetry. He says that one knows many instances where suffering has profited a man. But we also know many cases of the direct opposite. And these are all cases of what he calls profound, earnest, outrageous suffering. And that is what Chekhov is showing us. Look at Chekhov's men and women, plainly drawn from life, or at any rate exceedingly lifelike. Uncle Vanya, an old man of 50, cries beside himself all over the stage, saying things like, my life is done for, my life is done for, and senselessly shoots at a harmless professor. The hero in a tedious story was the quiet, happy man engaged in work of real importance, when suddenly a horrible disease stole upon him, not killing him, but taking him between its loathsome jaws. And we can ask, what for? What was the point of that? We'll come back to that in a moment. Chekhov's girls and women, they're mostly young, innocent, fascinating, and there always lies in wait for them round every corner a meaningless, rude, ugly misery which murders even the most modest hopes. They sob bitterly, but fate takes no notice. And then the question is, well, what justifies this? And the answer is nothing. This sort of thing happens to us human beings. And Chekhov doesn't weep and doesn't explain in the sense that metaphysicians do, right? Metaphysics undertakes an explanation where common sense stops. Metaphysics will say, we have seen many instances where at first glance suffering seemed absurd and needless, but where later on a profound significance was revealed. Thus it may be that what we cannot explain may find its explanation in time. And Shestov is saying that Chekhov is saying, no. That's not the case. There is no redemption of the suffering in these cases. That is not what is actually happening here. And he says, here on earth, dreams and hopes are only awakened, not fulfilled. So with long speeches, metaphysics whispers to us, and we repeat them, leaving out the it may be, right? And he says, sometimes we believe them and forge our philosophies from them. And so we come back full circle. Chekhov has characters who have philosophies, right? And he can handle these sorts of things, but he doesn't buy into them in his own life as the artist, as the person who lives a life. And you get the idea that Shestov thinks that he's rather prudent in taking such a stance.